Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar in our Emerging Practice series. My name is Jessica Gorham, and I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor, working on behalf of the GBV AOR, or Area of Responsibility, based at UNFPA, but representing all of our members across the region. In addition to being the regional advisor for the GBV AOR, I am also the co-chair of the regional GBV working group for East and Southern Africa. And I see a lot of familiar names joining us today. So many of you know we do have regular webinars where we are a series where we highlight emerging practices that we identify in different countries. And we're really happy today to be highlighting an activity that was taken place in the DRC. Today we have our GBV subcluster coordinator, Anita Akumia, who will be our presenter today. And she will be taking us through a donor mapping exercise that they recently did across the DRC. She will look at, she will present some of the findings. She will also present how that impacted different levels of organizations, for instance, NGOs compared to UN agencies, compared to some of our local and community-based organizations. And then we'll also tell us how she's using these results, or how the members in DRC are using these results to do increased advocacy. And I noticed that we have quite a few of our GBV coordinators from other countries also joining us today. So we're hoping that, again, this is a practice that we can replicate in other countries so that we can better understand the donor environment, but more importantly, also prioritization as well. Similar to our other webinars, everyone will be on mute throughout the presentation. We would request, please, if you could write any questions that you might have for Anita in the chat. And throughout the presentation, I will be monitoring the chat and then writing those questions down. I will be noting them, and then I'll communicate to you as well. And then during the Q&A period, I will present the questions to Anita. And if there's any time left, then we will allow individuals to ask questions off mic or unmuted. But we find this is a good way for us to streamline the questions, and then also to group like questions together so that everybody has an opportunity to have their questions answered. So if you could please bear with us for that, we would appreciate it. And lastly, this will be 1 hour. We're usually really good about keeping time. So we will keep this to 1 hour. And also, if you could please write your name, organization, and the country in which you are working in the chat. We would appreciate that as well, because it helps us monitor how well we're getting our invitations out and which countries are participating, and how we can do a little bit more outreach to other countries whom we don't see so many names from. So if you could please write your name, organization, and the country in which you are working in the chat, we would really appreciate that. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to, again, our special guest, Anita Akumia, who is the GBV subcluster coordinator in the DRC. Anita?
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon to you all. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you on this very interesting activity. So without wasting too much time, I'll just go on very quickly. As Jessica indicated, this is a donor mapping that we did for the DRC to show where the funding is, and to help us to guide us in our response activities, but also to guide us to know where the services are not, and what we need to do to pre-position services. Slide, please. So this presentation, we will just take you through very rapidly the GBV situation in the DRC, what happened in 2020, and also the situation in the first quarter of 2021, which certainly informed this donor mapping. Then we would look at the methodology that we use to collect the data on this, and then we will move on very rapidly to the key results that came out, and then some advocacy points. We inserted a last slide on some lessons learned that we thought that it would be useful, particularly if we have donors joining us to to highlight. Slide, please. So in terms of the magnitude of GBV, or the scale of GBV in the DRC, of course you would see from the map, and we will talk about it a bit more in details as to what the severity means. But generally, the situation in the DRC has been as a result of armed conflicts in the northeastern side, basically in Ituri, North Kivu, and then the South Kivu, and then also in for intercommunity conflicts in the Tanganyika areas, which also is present in South Kivu. We also have the situation of rapid population movements. That is, we have a lot of displaced populations, particularly in the Kivus, and then the situation of the returnees, which happened with the influx of the returnees from Angola. Then also the situation of customary related conflicts and land related issues in the Kasai region, as well as insecurities and the impact of the COVID-19. Slide. In terms of the GBV severity, you would see from the map that 7 provinces are in the category we would say is catastrophic, which means that, I mean, it's very serious and grave, and we are usually looking at a GBV situation of more than 100% increase, from time to time, or even in the year. Then we are looking at 13 out of the 26 provinces have a critical severity level score. I think that for us who have been working on the HRP, we are a bit more familiar with the severity scores. And then some 6 provinces are in a severe level. So I just put a bit of information as to orient us as to how we came about on the severity score, taking into account all the other factors, including food insecurity. Slide. So the objectives of the mapping exercise was to help us identify the humanitarian hubs where GBV prevention and response projects were being funded. It was also to help identify donors who fund GBV prevention and response activities, um, and then identify the funding gaps based on the duration of funding. For instance, we know that some funding cycles are short, others are longer. So when the funding is running out, where do we need to focus our attentions on in terms of resource mobilization? And then also to help us understand the nature of donors and the responses that were being funded. So, humanitarian versus a more development oriented funding. And by humanitarian, I mean to say that funding for more on a short-term basis, or funding on a more long-term basis, but also to look at the type of activities that were being funded, that is prevention as against response activities. And then finally, to help us have some kind of advocacy points for the donor community, in relation to where they need to focus on, or where to, so to speak, spread the financing to cover more grounds. Slide. Slide, please. In terms of the data collection and the methodology that we used, so first of all, we did a bit of desk review, to understand a bit what type of information we wanted to collect, or what type of information we wanted to find out. And once we were able to do that, I mean, the desk review helped us to, of course, understand which type of partners were contributing information, and where the information was coming from. And it also helped us to determine what kind of indicators to formulate to collect the data we wanted to collect. So in terms of from then on, we developed the indicators based on the information we wanted to collect. And then through that, we used that to develop the Excel matrix that was validated at the regional level. By regional level, I mean at the hub level, and then also validated at the level of the coordination at the national level. Then we gave time, about 10 days, for subcluster members to collect that data. Slide. Slide, please. So then, from then on, the IM team had time, in collaboration with all the GBV subcluster coordinators at the regional level, but also at the local level, to process the information. And then we went through a series of review and validation of the data. Following the review and validation, we moved on to produce the map, or the graph to show, to respond to all the various indicators. Then we did a bit of analysis, and then the development of the narrative by the coordination. Slide. So just to take you through the indicators that we settled on based on the desk review we did. We settled on geographic coverage. So we wanted to find out the number of humanitarian hubs that were being funded by a project, and then also we wanted to also find out the funding type. So number of projects that is disaggregated by type in terms of humanitarian and development. So it indicated funding that is dedicated for response to GBV in humanitarian emergencies versus funding that is was dedicated to GBV in a more development oriented situation. Slide. um the other indicators also, we're looking at slide, please. Yes, then we looked at the type of organizations that were receiving funding. So, is it a UN organization? Is it an international NGO, a national NGO, or a women-led organization? We decided that we needed to prioritize the women-led organizations to show whether they were actually receiving funding because of the activities they were engaged in. And with experience, a lot of women-led organizations engage in a lot of advocacy related issues and creating protective environments for women and girls. So we wanted to be sure that we wanted to check what kind of funding they were receiving for their activities. Also, we wanted to check project duration. Were projects more long term, or were they more programmatic in nature? That is long term versus whether they were short term or not. Slide. So just to show you some of the results that came out as a result of the exercise, you would see the map to your left. And we found out that, and just to clarify, you would see that in the indicators we didn't talk about the exact, we didn't ask partners or GBV actors the exact amount of funding they are receiving from a donor. We all know in with our experience that this is always a sensitive issue when you're asking partners. So we try to be dynamic, to collect information that would still be useful for us and that would still be able to analyze and use for our advocacy purposes. So based on that, we realized that 60% of funding that was coming in was concentrated in the eastern provinces. And if you would recall the earlier map that I showed you, areas, it also showed the areas that have high severity in GBV. Also, 71.8% of projects were devoted to responding to humanitarian crisis. And then 80% of those projects have a duration of 12 months, whilst 20% was just varying between 3 months to 5 years. So majority of the projects was looking at a 1 year duration, which of course with experience is not too great for our GBV interventions when we are looking at a more long-term response approach. Slide. So you would look at this, just a bit of analysis to look at the funding mapping versus our severity map. You would see that where we had the funding, like in the Kivus, or you would see that there is a lot of funding in the Kivus in the northeastern side, and it's also corresponding to our severity map. But if you look at the Kasai region, you would see that there's not too much funding in the Kasai Oriental, but there is some level of severity there by way of GBV cases. So it was very interesting to see, where some of the funding is going vis-a-vis the severity of the GBV cases. Slide. So in terms of main results, with regard to the geographic coverage, specifically 53% of the funding is concentrated in the humanitarian hub of the northeastern side, that is the North Kivu and Ituri. Now you realize that the central eastern side, which is South Kivu and Maniema, southeastern, which is the Tanganyika, the Okatanga and the Kasai Alps, as compared to the other region, you could say are benefiting from a less funding despite the severity of the GBV cases. So majority of the funding is going to North Kivu and Ituri, and the rest is shared amongst the other humanitarian hubs. Slide. In terms of funding by donors, you would see that from the table, majority of the funding is coming from the humanitarian pool fund to GBV. It's coming from the humanitarian fund, and we are grateful for that, of course. The next, of course, there's also funding from the World Bank and the social fund, or the Fond Social of the Democratic Republic du Congo, which is contributing to 21.8% of funding. There's also funding from Canada. And the interesting thing about the Canadian funds is also that it looks at both humanitarian response and development as well. Um, yes, so basically, we just wanted to show you the main donors. If you look at the graph, you would see in terms of who is funding more, the humanitarian fund, the Fond Social, Canada, you would see the World Bank, Japan, Sweden, and so on and so forth. But the large donor to GBV is the humanitarian fund, followed by the Fond Social, Canada, and then the World Bank. Slide. In terms of who is receiving this funding, you would see that 46% of the funding is going to international organizations, so international NGOs. 20% of that funding is going to the local NGOs. Sorry. And then then 1% of the funding is just going to women-led organizations. UN agencies receive 33% of funding, but this funding has also taken, or I mean, it goes to the NGOs. Um, slide, slide, please. So in terms of the duration of projects, you will see that 60% of the funding covers a period of 6 to 18 months, while 30% go beyond the 18-month mark. Just 10%, which is good for us, goes into just 10% covers a period of 1 to 6 months. Slide. In terms of activities that are funded, you will realize that, or we realize that 80% of activities are response based, and then just 10% goes into prevention. Another interesting fact that it would be good to mention to you was that it would seem that a lot of the prevention activities were linked to response rather than behavior change communication. So you would realize that the activities indicated under prevention were linked to sensitization as to where to go for services, and not necessarily change of behavior for for communities. In terms of specific response activities, 43% of funding was linked to medical response. 47% of it is in psychosocial support, which you could say enjoys the largest chunk of response. And then just 3% goes into legal, and 7% goes into socioeconomic reintegration. Slide. In terms of advocacy and what we hope to do with this information, is that we want to be able to advocate for the underfunded crisis, particularly in Tanganyika, in Maniema, in Kasai Central, and the Kasai. Particularly for the Tanganyika and Kasai Central, it's the two provinces that are also going through the nexus approach. So, it would seem that there's some kind of misunderstanding when it comes to support or humanitarian support for areas that have been deemed to be identified as a nexus zone. So it would be useful for us. This findings would help us to advocate with the donor community to position some kind of funding for the underfunded crisis that is going on in these areas. The other advocacy points that I would like to mention is in terms of capacity building associations to be able to access funding, because it's interesting to note that in terms of eligibility for the humanitarian pooled fund, there are not so many there. In terms of putting together proposals that allows them to receive funding. So one of the things that we would want to do is to advocate for capacity building as much as possible for the NGOs, but particularly for women-led associations. Slide. We also are looking at the advocacy in terms of donor community, in terms of granting more funds to, yes, I mentioned women-led associations. that I mentioned already. And then, some kind of roundtable with donors of the DRC to advocate for a more resilience type of projects, a more projects that look at projects that look at women empowerment, but also strengthening coordination. It's very interesting to note that if you look at most all these fundings, it went a lot into response. You could say that no particular funding supports coordination per se. So it would be very good that our donors look at a more you could say holistic appreciation of GBV by way of prevention, by way of response, but also by way of supporting the coordination to effectively, support some of these GBV partners, whether they be local or they be international. Yes, slide. In terms of lessons learned, and I'm glad I added this portion after a good discussion with Jessica. The need to engage donors directly to have information on funds given to partners. I think that one of the things that we saw during this exercise is how sensitive issues of funding is, and the fact that it's not a comfortable conversation to have with GBV actors. So it would be good, and moving forward, if we could also engage with the donor community. The reason why this was not done initially was because we didn't want partners to feel as though this was an audit exercise. We wanted partners to feel like this was an information sharing exercise to help improve upon our work, but to also advocate for more funding for our work. And but then it would be good that moving forward we could explore the possibility of getting information both at the donor level but also at the partner level. Another aspect that we found out, which was very interesting, was that um, partners suddenly have become motivated to share information, and it's a good lesson learned for us, because initially we used to be, you would say, a bit more kind and gentle with partners who were not really sharing information. So we used to try to get to wait on information. So even when we have a deadline as to when we wanted to share information, we used to be patient with a lot of partners, trying to cajole or coax, I'm not sure what the word is, to get partners to share information. And it used to take forever. But when we shared this information, we got a bit very rapid response from partners saying that, yes, you didn't take this into account. But the feedback was that you don't share your information on time. So it was a good lesson learned for us to not wait upon partners to share information in their own time. The other aspect I would like to also mention is in terms of accountability and how we can make, how, donors can be accountable to the subcluster, but also the subcluster can be accountable to the donor community, and GBV actors being accountable to the subcluster and to the donor community, so that we, and this is to ensure that we have as much as information as possible to share. Because I think that between the donor community, the GBV subcluster, and GBV actors, we have one common goal, and that is to ensure that beneficiaries are reached with quality services. I think that is a united goal that we have. And for that, I think we need to come together to ensure some kind of accountability at all levels, by sharing information as openly and as honestly as we can, bearing in mind that it is not to indict people, but it's to improve upon what we are doing for beneficiaries. Thank you. I think that I would end there. Over to you, Jessica. I timed myself, so I'm sure I remain in the 30 minutes. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Anita. That was really helpful. And we do have some questions that were generated privately in the chat, some that I generated, and then a few others too that were publicly posted in the chat. So
Thank you. That's all from my end. I'm sure you're hearing me well.
yes. And are you able to hear me?
Yes, Jessica. I can hear you.
Okay, great. Good, good. I think there's a bit of a delay on your side, Anita, on your sound, so we will note that as we're giving questions, but we could hear you well. I'm going to quickly go through some of our questions, but please keep putting questions in the chat as they come along. As I said, there were some questions that were private messaged on the chat, some open message questions, and then some that I had on behalf of the GBV AOR that I thought would also be interesting to clarify as well. You noted that 71.8% of projects were humanitarian projects. Could you tell us a little bit more about the approximately 30% of projects? I assume those were development. And can you kind of connect that to the humanitarian development nexus? Because we're getting a lot of questions, rightfully so, about how our programming can go on the continuum of the nexus. And it looks like you do have a set of funding, around 30%, that looks at more development. And I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of feedback on how that relates to the nexus. Over, Anita?
I'm sorry, Jessica. I lost you for 2 whole minutes. I was disconnected. It was my connection. I had a connection problem. So I apologize if you could
Repeat.
ask the questions
Yes,
again.
I
Yes,
certainly can. Yeah, the first question is about humanitarian development nexus. You mentioned that 71.8% of your projects are deemed humanitarian projects, and the assumption would be that 30% of those.
I'm sorry, Jessica. I'm not getting it. I'm not sure if it's my connection.
Are others hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly, Jessica.
Okay. Yes. I think it might be your connection. Anita, can you? Okay. Anita, can you hear us? We might have lost Anita, unfortunately. Why don't we had a couple of questions, and I think that I might call out some of our, while we're trying to get Anita back online, she had mentioned in the breakdown of her analysis that a good chunk of funding comes from the social fund of the Republic, I think it was called, and then she linked that to World Bank funding. And I know for many of our members from different humanitarian settings, this is unique probably to DRC, particularly also the presence of the World Bank as a key donor. And I'm wondering, while we're waiting for Anita to come back online, I might call out one of our colleagues. I see that Verena is on the line, and I'm going to unmute Verena, and I'm wondering if you can maybe give us a little bit of. Okay, Anita, I'm just turning over to Verena, and then I'm going to come back to you. But Verena, maybe you could help us a little bit sort of to understand that relationship, because I think it's new to many of our members in other countries.
Yeah, so this is, and Anita, if you can hear me, this is Verena Phipps, and I'm the team lead for the World Bank Finance GBV Prevention and Response Project in Eastern DRC. And it's a $100 million project that's concentrated in 4 provinces in Eastern DRC. And as with the bank's funding modalities, we work through government partners. So our financing flows through the government institutions we partner with. So in this particular instance for this project, our financing flows through and the project is implemented by the Fonds Social. And I noted in your presentation, there seemed to be a differentiation between the two, when in fact the funding sources are the same. So I think that that's something to consider when looking at donor financing. But then through the project, the Fonds Social has contracted a range of other partners, including Pansy, Heal Africa, different NGO consortia, and then also works with CBOs in addition to provincial level health centers and the Ministry of Gender. So that's just to give a sense of how we're operating in this space. But it is fundamentally through the government partnerships that we have with the Fonds Social. I don't know if that's helpful, if you have any other questions.
It's very helpful. Thanks, Verena. So Anita, while you were coming back on, we had a couple of questions around a unique funding modality, I think, to DRC, which is the social fund, and how you linked that to the World Bank. And since you were offline, I asked the World Bank to actually give that response. And so we thank Verena for that. I'm going to come back to the question about the nexus. So our question, Anita, was that 71, you all are probably tired of hearing this question, but I'm going to get it out there. 71.8% of projects are humanitarian, and that leads us to believe, or gives the assumption, that 30% are not humanitarian funded. And we were wondering if you could give us a little bit of analysis on the nexus, the development humanitarian nexus, and where those development projects, so a little bit of information on the breakdown. So 70 to 30, over.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you, Verena, for that explanation. In terms of the humanitarian ratio to the more, you could say, nexus approach, you know, for just maybe to try to clarify a bit. So a lot of the funding goes into where you could say there are active or some kind of ongoing humanitarian crisis. So you would realize that you know, in the North Kivus, some parts of the South Kivu, you would note that a lot of the funding that is even there is responding to active, or you could say ongoing, humanitarian crisis. Now, if you take the Kasai region, which has been known following you know, the Kasai region used to be in active conflict somewhere in 2017, 2018. But since then, it's been classified as a region that is becoming more and more stable. But that would seem that it's more on paper as against what the reality is from, you know, a visit to the field site. So the areas like the Tanganyika and the Kasai, that has been classified as moving away from a raging humanitarian crisis to what, you know, a more not stable but relatively stable, that allows for putting in place some kind of long-term measures, are the ones that are not receiving as much humanitarian funding or projects as compared to you know, the other areas in the Kivus. Now, what is interesting is that you know, there's a lot of activities by way of Nexus in these areas. We had a big Nexus workshop in the Kasai, and I think the idea is, of course, to mobilize resources tailored towards a more long-term GBV response for those areas. But of course, the advocacy is that in the meantime, you know, we need to be able to respond to ongoing GBV concerns there. And so we need to, in the meantime that we are waiting for a more long-term development-oriented funding for those areas, we need to be able to channel some of these humanitarian projects or humanitarian response to these areas. So I'm not sure, I don't know if I have answered your question, but yeah, over to you if you need further clarification.
I think that was good, Anita. Thank you. I'm going to read off this one specifically from the chat. It's from Oswald, and he's wondering about the Ebola virus disease. Doesn't seem to be among your criteria for severity. Do you think that North Kivu and Ituri would have benefited more from more funding because of the combination of military operations in these regions and the Ebola crisis? In Ituri and North Kivu help with advocacy for fundraising. Do you think that the low presence of GBV services could be an indicator of severity?
Yeah, I think I get you, Jessica.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, interestingly enough, the North Kivu has the most funding, and that is because the North Kivu, because of all the issues of Ebola, but also the humanitarian challenges, enjoys what you would call the North Kivu enjoys from various baskets. So the North Kivu enjoyed some kind of, I wouldn't say, well, enjoy seems to be like, but the North Kivu benefited from, response or funding that was dedicated to Ebola. It also benefited from fundings that was dedicated to, reserve funding of, that was dedicated to specific crisis. And the North Kivu also benefited from various standard allocations, but also benefits from all these donor funding that Verena even mentioned. So the North Kivu is actually one of the places that is most funded. And Ebola was certainly taken into account, particularly, and the North Kivu is also the areas that benefits from beyond what do you call it, the funding that went into or goes, was used for Ebola response. You would also see that in the various projects that was written for Ebola, we took into account the vulnerabilities that women would face as a result of Ebola, but also in terms of PSA related issues. And so in that regard, the North Kivu really benefited, and it was certainly taken into account, when we were looking at severity and resource mobilization. Over.
Great. Thank you, Anita. We had a couple questions about the engagement of donors in this process. And I think you answered the first one, which was that did you receive information from donors and organizations, or did you just seek information from organizations? And I think you answered that, but let's maybe get a recap then, Anita, and then I'll do the second part question from Diane.
Okay, thank you. So just, of course, a recap to say that we focus on organizations and not the donor. So we focus on GBV actors that were receiving funding from various donors. And I think that would also explain the preoccupation of Verena concerning the Fond Social, because for a lot of partners, the feedback that they gave was that, well, our donor is the Fond Social. And I think that, that would explain it. So just to answer that, we got information from GBV partners and GBV actors and not GBV donors. Over.
Okay. And Anita, have you presented this to donors? And if not, what's the next step for you from the AOR perspective?
So as I mentioned to you, and then also in the presentation, that one of the activities that we have planned is a donor roundtable that allows us to bring donors to the table, but present this to them, but also have some kind of in-depth conversation. For instance, in terms of prevention activities, propose something a bit more concrete as to what donors can do or how they can support prevention activities that is geared towards behavior change, rather than only response. So yes, it is planned for us to have a donor roundtable with all the key actors in GBV to have this conversation.
Great.
Over to you,
Thanks,
Jessica.
Anita. So it sounds like in addition, Anita, it sounds like this webinar is your first step to getting this information out, maybe a little bit more informally. But then next step is to have a formal donor roundtable where you can discuss in more detail the analysis around this. And I think what you said, Anita, around prevention, Laura from UNHCR asked the similar one. It's about what can the AOR do to engage donors more in prevention. And it sounds like the first thing you want to do is bring the donors around the table to discuss the analysis or the results of this exercise. I think for our last question, because we only have about 10 minutes left, and there was a bit of discussion in the chat around longevity. And I said it's sort of my sad awareness that for me, 18 months was like 10 years in humanitarian language. But Chi brought up, and rightfully so, Chi from Population Council said, actually, that's not such a long time, particularly if you want to look at prevention and behavior change. And I think sometimes in the humanitarian context, those of us working directly in humanitarian, it is 18 months seems like forever, but it's not. And I think here in the DRC, you have a unique opportunity because it sounds like you're starting to, to look at both ends of that continuum. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about, it says here that 60%, I think you mentioned, 60% of your funding is sort of longer term funding. And you use that term longer term, which is around 18 months. Yeah, and Laura said too, 18 months is very short to work on prevention. So maybe we could talk a little bit more in our last 5 minutes, a little bit more about that in terms of the longer term funding and how we can start the conversation, or how even you've leveraged that. Because in places like South Sudan, we would love to have projects that are funded for 18 months, to be honest, and in some other contexts as well. In Mozambique and the Cabo Delgado region, we don't have any projects that are funded that long. So, sorry. So if you could maybe give us a little bit more analysis on the longer term funding, and then I can also put Chi, if you wanted to add in here, because I know you had a couple comments, I can also put you off mute as well. But we'll get Anita, and then Chi, if you want to give another sort of analysis on that. So over to Anita. Over.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So, I think it's also interesting to mention that within the 60%, we are seeing 6 to 12 to 18 months, but a lot of it is also 12 months. And yes, it's on paper, 18 months looks good. But in terms of what we are able to do within the 18 months, prevention doesn't come in at all, because like I mentioned, the prevention activities are only sensitization related, and they are linked to directing people to services. So we are not able to really show, it doesn't show by way of, and I think that's also, it's interesting to say that that's also contributes to the donor fatigue, because it's difficult to keep going back to donors to say, yeah, we need more funding, but then it's the same cycle. We keep seeing an increase in the number of cases, and so it causes some donor fatigue. But then on the other hand, a lot of the donors are also very um I don't know, I think perhaps response looks a bit more attractive than prevention because response shows numbers. So I think that the donor roundtable would be very useful for us to explain some of these things. But then just to come back to the what we term a bit more long-term funding, I think that it would also, it's interesting and it's good to also congratulate our key donors when it comes to long-term funding, because long-term funding is coming particularly from the World Bank, and then also from Canada. and then you know, some of it from Sweden. And it's good to note that, you know, it's also some kind of understanding from the donor. And some of the lessons learned from the DRC side is that, you know, you need to engage the subcluster, because a lot of the conversations around this funding that are a bit long term also involved engagement with the subcluster, you know, in the conversation, to be able to show, you know, where the gaps are, but also what is needed to effectively respond. And on that note, I think that I would also congratulate USAID, because USAID has the tendency to contact the subcluster, you know, in terms of when they want to fund a particular project or go into a particular province. So it allows us to, you know, kind of advocate, but also to advise in terms of what, you know, how the funding should look like. The other thing that I want to also mention to you in this regard is that the funding duration looks like it's 6 to 18 months, but in reality, what is able to happen within that, taking into account all the challenges that we deal with in, you know, procurement of equipment or products for response and all that. So yes, that's what I would say in terms of, you know, what we are doing long term with this funding. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Anita. So it sounds like what you're saying is what we deem long-term funding in reality is not, even when we're talking about 18 months. And I saw that from many of our participants in the chat. So we have approximately 5 minutes, and I wanted to quickly just to sort of summarize some things. Some interest as well around, as you mentioned, that you weren't able to, I know one of our colleagues, Tama, had a question around getting those figures, the exact amount of money that is allocated for GBV. And you mentioned that it's a very sensitive topic. And so for this first exercise, you really wanted to sort of present it as a more of a just an exploratory way to get this initial information. And so this is something I think we as a community can look at, because it's important for us to know what in fact these numbers are, right? The percentages don't tell us so much if we don't understand the baseline. So I think for us as a GBV community, we need to see how we can break through some of those sensitivities, because as we saw, who is getting hurt or impacted the most is our women-led and community-based organizations who have less than 1% of the funding. And so I think if we are really motivated and dedicated to ensuring that those on the very front line are getting the funding and support they need, then we need to have a way to overcome some of these sensitivities. And secondly, what I think another takeaway for us would be, if at this donor roundtable, and I think this is another maybe lesson for all of us to take away from this, it would seem very important to have both humanitarian and development actors at that table. Because as Anita said, it sounds like you all there in DRC are really straddling that nexus in many of your regions. And so in order for us to look at some of those issues of longevity, prevention, and again, it was mentioned in the chat that if we are really invested in ensuring that women and community-based organizations are getting the support that they need, then we need to merge and see more complementarity between the development and humanitarian sector. And lastly, if we could just, Anita, last question is, can you share with us the tools? And is there going to be a final report or do you anticipate you presenting this in sort of these forums? So last two questions before we close, Anita, would be one, is there a way that other subclusters around the world, in fact, could use could do the same exercise if you could share the tools? And then the second is there a final report that contains all of this consolidated, more comprehensive analysis? Over to you, Anita.
Yes, thank you so much, Jessica. And yeah, we are happy to support, other GBV subclusters with tools, but also maybe some kind of bilateral conversation on how as to how to go about it. We're happy to do that and share the practice. Concerning the analysis, we would put together a final report that will certainly be shared. We also wanted to have this opportunity to have the chat, but to do this webinar, which I'm grateful to Jessica for, to help us give us some, sort of feedback from you as well, that we can maybe highlight in the final report that might be useful for readers. So thank you, and over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Anita. And I think there were some great comments about ways, about methodology, and then also content that you can bring out in that final report. And I think you were really, it was a really good step to have this as a sort of starting point. So please, for everybody online, if you would like to see the tools, this PowerPoint presentation, or a copy, or if you'd like to hear the recording of this or send it on to your colleagues, you can find it on the GBV AOR website. And I think my colleague Philippe will be putting on, again, the details for that. Again, if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint to listen to the recording or to access the tools, you can find that on the GBV AOR website, and we're going to, again, put those links into the chat. I would like to thank my colleagues at the global level, Philippe and Shiva, who have provided support to the webinar today. And then also, really big thanks to Anita, who put this all together while she's also on a field mission. So we really do appreciate it. But I think, Anita, you've seen that this is just a starting point for all of us. And so thank you for all the work that you've put into this exercise and for sharing it with all of the other coordinators and members throughout the region and throughout the world, because we have quite a few countries represented outside of the region. If you or your colleagues are interested in attending a similar session in French, please do join us tomorrow at the same time. And my colleague from our member organization, UNFPA, will be moderating that session. Her name is Julie Jallo, but you'll see many of the same faces, Philippe and Anita, but that session will be in French. So please do join us. We will have another upcoming emerging practice next month, and we hope to highlight a behavior change study that was done in Burundi. And the results of that and how we can accept that as an emerging practice as well. So please do join us for our next emerging practice, which will hopefully take place next month. And we'll look at behavior change and how we can all incorporate that into our work plans as well. So on behalf of the regional GBV working group, we'd really like to thank you for your participation, and we hope to see you online again. Thank you very much.